Hi, everyone. So sorry about the difficulties. Still trying to figure it out as we go. But thank you all so much for being here and for this important conversation during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So without further ado, I'll give Janelle her respect with her bio, give a little bio and information about herself to introduce, and I'll let her take over. Um, so Dr. Janelle White is the executive director of San Francisco Women Against Rape, the city's oldest rape crisis center and a leader in survivor-centered advocacy. With over 15 years of frontline experience in the movement to end sexual and domestic violence, Dr. White brings a powerful combination of grassroots organizing, academic scholarship, and a visionary leadership to her work. She earned her PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan in 2005, where her doctoral research explored Black women's mobilization to the United States to confront sexual and domestic violence. Her career has spanned community-based organizations and higher education, including work with the University of Michigan Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center, the YWCA Rape Crisis Program of Greater New Orleans, Incite Women of Color Against Violence, and the Hate Crimes Project of the Lesbian and Gay Community Center of New Orleans. Dr. White has also contributed to the academic spaces as an assistant professor of sociology at the University of New Orleans and served as the director of UNO Women's Center. She later joined the faculty at San Francisco State University as a lecturer in women and gender studies, where she taught courses on African American women's history and the intersections of gender and prison industrial complex. Across all her work, Dr. White centers the experiences of marginalized communities and pushes for systemic change rooted in racial justice, gender equity, and survivor liberation. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you all to the extraordinary Janelle White.
Thank you for that. Wow. I'm like, who is that person? Um, well, I want to start. First, can everyone hear me? Or is okay. Yay. All right. I want to just say thank you. I'm really humbled and honored to be asked to speak. As was mentioned, I have a lot of commitment to supporting and fostering, especially Black women and women of color's participation in the anti-rape and battered women's movements or the sexual assault and domestic violence movement. That means a lot. To be recognized and asked to come and speak is really means a lot to me. So thank you, Black Women Revolt Against Domestic Violence. Um, I want to, I want to start a little bit with continue a little bit with my biography. What wasn't shared is what got me engaged in this work. And that's because I'm a sexual assault survivor. When I started my work with the movement in 1994, I really needed an outlet to be able to channel my anger, my disbelief, my shock, just trying to kind of work through the trauma of having experienced a sexual assault and doing prevention education, engaging with the community, being in classrooms and community organizations really is what made me tap into my power and resilience. So really, again, what I found, and I feel like probably this will speak to many of you here, is so many of us are survivors of sexual violence and or other forms of gender-based violence. And doing this work is a way in which we heal. And so I really want to hold that up and respect that. Um, and I also want to talk about largely today, I'm going to tell you some about SFWAR, but I also want to bring to the forefront the voices of Black feminists who are often overlooked in terms of their long-term work with the anti-rape movement in the United States. Sadly, I think there is a misconception that Black women are not engaged in this work when we really are and have been historically. In fact, it's been necessary for us to be involved in this work for our own survival. So I want to spend some time talking, a little bit about some of that history too. I have a short video I'd like to share with you that highlights some of the perspective of some of our OG Black feminists who've been engaged in this work, and also another SF warrior who's been engaged in the work for a long time, who's a woman of Asian descent. So I have that short video, and then I understand from Andrea that there's some questions that folks might have. So I hope at the end there'll be time for questions you have or whatnot. But I don't expect this next part of me talking about SFWAR and playing the video. I'm guessing probably about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we can have the rest of the time. So I think we're doing okay on time and things. So our folks, are you situated? You can hear okay? Everyone thumbs up if you're good, or something in the chat. Okay, great, fantastic. Um, so I am coming up on 30 years of work in the anti-rape and battered women's movements and domestic violence movement. Um, I am I always say that there's very few of us that are so blessed as me to be able to, for the long haul, continue this work. And especially because I've had two different paths at SFWAR. I first joined SFWAR in the late 90s for a couple of years as a program director. I left in the late 90s, went to New Orleans, thought that that was going to be the end of it all for me. That's where it was going to be my home base. I would retire there. I was working at the University of New Orleans and directing the Women's Center. I had a tenure track faculty position in sociology. I was doing the work that I loved with folks that, I had utmost respect for. And Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005 and really uprooted everything for me and so many other people, right? And with that, I made some decisions, and the door for SF was open still. There are lots of people I knew in the Bay Area from my first stint at SF from 97 to 99. In 2005, they happened to be hiring for an executive director. I applied, and I was hired. So I started in 2006 at SF as executive director. There has been no other organization that I've worked with that is like San Francisco Women Against Rape. I really didn't believe that I would ever come back, in part because I felt like SF gave me so much. I learned so much on the ground. That I just didn't expect that I would, ever have anything I could offer and come back and offer. But, going away for those years that I was away, I built more skills and felt really humbled again to be able to come back to an organization that I respected so much and to be able to offer something that I felt like, that I could reciprocate. So in that way, it's felt full circle for me in many regards, but also just so blessed to be able to continue doing this work. And some people might think, blessed doing anti-rape work? What are you talking about? Well, I find lots of power in the work that we do. And we'll talk some about that when I talk about the services that we provide and our philosophy. But I feel like our mobilizations to address gender-based violence are very powerful sites. And so, we need to, make sure that that is at the forefront, that folks see them in that way. Because again, I think we can be powerful sites for other survivors and our allies to kind of come together and mobilize to address all kinds of issues of oppression and violence. Sadly, sexual violence is often connected with many of the social problems and issues that communities are addressing. So um, it's a place where we can find power. It's not just doom and gloom and trauma. It is a very powerful place for us too. So I want to acknowledge that. Um, so let me tell you some about SFWAR, and then we'll move into to kind of talk about some of the Black women who've been really instrumental in the anti-rape movement historically. But SFWAR was founded in 1973 in San Francisco. Um, we actually, when we were founded, it was all volunteers. 1973, had no government grants, no city contracts. The work was all funded by folks either doing their own fundraising or putting their own money in. What SFWAR did during that time is they rented an apartment in the Mission District and set up the hotline in that apartment. It was a 20-hour a week hotline when we started in 1973. Um, and in fact, the women who rented that apartment had to dissemble a bit to the landlord and tell them that they were a secretary pool because women would be coming and going from the apartment to take their hotline shifts. Also, it was used as a site of emergency housing for folks who were escaping violence. So there are lots of folks coming and going from this apartment. So the way they explained it to the landlord was, we are a secretary pool. So people come in, they get their assignments, and then they leave. And so folks are coming and going, right? And that apartment and that hotline and all of the prevention education that was happening out and the organizing that was happening in 73 to about 1980, again, was all funded by the individual volunteers and folks who were part of this organization. So SF4 started as a collective in the 70s. We are not a collective anymore, but that's part of our story. We've been in the women's building since about 1980. So we've been a long time tenant in the San Francisco Women's Building. Very proud of that too. Um, we received our first state funding, government funding in 1980. Um, it was before Cal OES was Cal OES. Those of you who have Cal OES funding probably know who I'm talking about here. But before Cal OES was called that, they were called the Office of Criminal Justice Planning. So we were, SF4 was one of the first rape crisis programs in the state of California that received state funding in 1980. And we had that community-based rape crisis program contract with the California Office of Emergency Services since 1980. So again, it was mentioned that SF4 is the oldest but we are also the only community-based organization, rape crisis organization currently funded by Cal OES in the city currently. The way Cal OES does funding for rape crisis programs, this might be important for folks to know. They fund a rape crisis program in each county. A couple counties have a couple rape crisis programs. Alameda has two, but for the most part, throughout California, there's one community-based organization that's funded by the state. And that is recognized as the organization that does training of rape crisis counselors, that does service provision, all of those kinds of things. So SF4 has been that Cal OES identified rape crisis program since 1980. We've done a lot of work since the 80s to present. And I think before I talk about the work and the services that we provide, I want to talk a little bit about our philosophy and our analysis. I think that is so important and what really sets SF apart. And there's three through lines or three kind of themes that run through and that have always been foundational for SF War. And the first one is being survivor centered. I'm sure this is not a new idea for most of you all here. Um, so in terms of, we don't have an agenda. What we as advocates or rape crisis counselors are most interested in is supporting survivors and making decisions that work for them. Um, it may be reporting to law enforcement, but most of the time it's not. And sometimes people are surprised by that. I'm guessing many of you probably are not surprised because there's immense barriers to reporting for many survivors, especially as we look at women of color, immigrant women, folks who are limited English proficient, if you're part of the queer community or transgender. There's so many barriers to utilizing the state structure to try to find some kind of justice. But we do not have an agenda. If someone wants to report to law enforcement, we will support them and help them navigate through that process. If they don't, and they want to find other ways of healing and creating safety for themselves, we're committed to that. So being survivor centered, sometimes people call it now trauma informed. Um, that has been our method and approach since we were founded in 1973. I'm very proud of that as being kind of where one of our commitments. Um, Another commitment that has been since the very beginning is our understanding of sexual assault being a tool or weapon of oppression. So the reason why rape and sexual violence and harassment and also gender-based violence are happening in our communities is because of systems of oppression. And it could be because of male supremacy and patriarchy or heteropatriarchy. It could be because of white supremacy and racism. It could be because of xenophobia, transphobia. These systems, these structural systems, support violence. They support violence being used against marginalized communities to keep us in our place. So rape and the threat of rape has been historically a weapon that has been used by those in power. And so our foremothers in the 70s recognized that. They were unconditional in their recognition that rape is not only about male supremacy, it's about race and racism, it's about all of those systems of oppression. So in that way, we have maintained a political analysis around sexual assault as opposed to a public health approach, as opposed to a clinical approach. Those approaches, I think, are helpful to folks. A clinical approach can support someone with healing through therapeutic methods, right? Just as a public health approach can help to change attitudes and norms about sexual assault and sexual violence. But a political analysis is ultimately going to end rape because we have to dismantle and challenge those systems of oppression if we really want to end rape. As otherwise, as a movement, what we're doing is we're helping people, putting a cast on after a trauma of sexual violence. We're helping them kind of heal, and then sending folks right back out into a rape culture. So the work is really important to dismantle those systems of oppression. So our anti-oppression analysis that has remained with us throughout is another really critical piece of who we are at SFWAR. And I think it's important for you all to know what our commitments are, especially if you're referring folks to us or you're asking us to come out or partner with you, that you know what our sensibilities are. And then finally, the third kind of through line is women of color leadership. SFWAR, in its really early configuration, made a commitment to prioritizing women of color leadership at every level of our organization. In the 70s, when we started, we were largely, it was majority middle class and working class white women. A good number of folks identified as queer or lesbian at that time too. Um, there was a very small number of women of color who were engaged in the work in the 70s when we started. But our foremothers were really clear about needing to challenge racism and also to ensure that women of color were engaged in the work at SFWAR in a way that was not tokenizing, that was about full participation, that was about and that meant some folks stepped away from the works to make space for women of color to be engaged, to be hired as staff and whatnot. Um, and that again, that commitment is important because sadly we know in the women's movement, racism is still an issue. And so often the voices and the leadership of women of color is suppressed. And so it has been so important for SF4 to maintain and build towards being, women of color led at every level of our organization. And we actually achieved that in 2000 when we finally hired our first woman of color executive director. We had slowly become majority women of color with the volunteer pool, with our board. Then we moved on to program directors and associates. And then finally, our executive director in 2000 that was brought on, Nina Youssef, was our first woman of color who joined SF4 as executive director. And I came in 2006 as the second. So we've had, a long history of being able to institutionalize women of color leadership and to hold up the importance of that. And it makes sense too, not just because of the oppression that we've experienced in the anti-rape movement as women of color, but also women of color are more likely to experience sexual assault. And we can talk about that in a moment, why that is the case, some of the understanding or my understanding about why we are more vulnerable to sexual violence and why we are more targeted and experience sexual violence at higher rates than other groups. So again, it made sense. It was critically important for those who are most impacted by the social problem of sexual violence to be leading the work. And we've maintained that. Sadly, while the anti-rape movement's been done powerful work since it was founded in 1970, we haven't ended rape yet, and sadly, we haven't necessarily turned the page on the rates of sexual violence, the increased rates of sexual violence that women of color experience. So we are still seeing that as a phenomenon, even though it's been over 50 years since the start of the anti-rape movement in 1970 in the United States. So that's a little about our analysis. I'm going to talk about our services, and I promise I'm going to play the video. It's a short 13-minute video, but let me talk some about our services because I know that can be important too for folks if you're thinking about referring folks to us. We run a 24/7 hotline, crisis line. I will put the number in the chat for you all right now. So there is the phone number. We collect calls. So especially important right now, we are getting a high number rate of calls from folks in immigration detention centers. We get a good number of calls from incarcerated survivors who need support inside. So knowing that we will collect calls is really important for folks to know. And the crisis line is largely the way people enter our services. So a call to the crisis line, even if someone's not needing crisis intervention in that moment, but they're wanting advocacy, or they want information about our counseling program. Calling the hotline is the best way to access our services. So, and again, it means someone's going to get a response immediately. They're not going to get a call back. They're going to talk to a counselor immediately. They might get a follow-up call back from one of our staff members, but at least they're talking to a voice immediately, and that's been so important, I think, to so many folks who are survivors, to make that be able to make immediate contact with someone who's going to validate their experience and help support them, and direct them to the things that they might want to do and need. Um, we also provide a range of advocacy and accompaniment services, medical advocacy and accompaniment to, for example, sexual assault exams that are done at General Hospital. We can have our advocate be available with the survivor during that exam if that's something that they would want. We've had that program in place since 1997. When I came to SFWAR, that was one of the programs I worked on in terms of getting on the ground, was the beginning of our in-person medical accompaniment services. Um, so, um, so yeah, so that is something else in terms of medical advocacy accompaniment. Social service advocacy accompaniment, if people need help with accessing housing, emergency housing, transitional housing, more long-term housing, if folks need support with basic needs, food, clothing. A lot of the survivors we work with are needing to get basic needs met and needs around safety met before they're able to move on to think about counseling or other things. So our advocacy work is so important to ensure that those needs are met so that folks can then continue through their healing journey. And then another piece of advocacy we do is criminal legal advocacy and accompaniment. Um, so if someone wants to make a police report, we can be with them when they make that report. We can go with them to the police station to make that report if they have concerns. If they are having problems with getting a follow-up from from the SVU investigators, Special Victims Unit, SFPD investigators, we can help them figure out who their investigator is and try to help get them some information. If they need their police report, because sometimes that's necessary, especially if they're navigating possibly getting out of a lease, or if they're in public housing and wanting to get a transfer, a report can be really important. Or if they're looking at other kind of victim compensation kind of things, having that report could be added to the file. You don't have to have a police report right now, thankfully, to apply for victim compensation, but it can be an important piece to add if people are taking that route, if there's some compensation that they would be entitled to as a victim of sexual assault or survivor of sexual assault. So those are advocacy and accompaniment services. Talked about the hotline. We also do counseling. We provide support groups. We provide individual peer counseling, and that counseling is normally 8 to 10 sessions. We also support family members and friends who can call the hotline, or also we can do 3 to 5 sessions with a family member or friend who might be dealing with vicarious trauma issues that they need support with. So that's another thing. So that's mostly our bucket of direct services. We also have another big bucket of prevention education work that we do. We have our Students Talking About Nonviolent Dating program has been around since 1997 also. It was founded in 1997. So that is the program where we actually go out into middle schools, high schools to do education work, raise the issue of sexual violence. We also do support groups in high schools, so that we're getting multiple opportunities to talk with the same group of students, because we recognize that one-time prevention education training is not nearly enough, right? People need ongoing support to kind of, especially young people need ongoing support to think through these issues and to figure out how they will interrupt harassment if they see it, how they will ensure that they're not engaging in coercive sexual behavior. You know, people need support to understand these things. And definitely, sadly, our current culture often gives the wrong information. So we've got a lot of misinformation that we have to counter in middle schools and high schools. And so STAND is such an important piece of our work with youth. We also do work with adults, with providers in terms of prevention education. We're in the community doing outreach, tabling at community events, all of that kind of thing. We will be doing an event in June or possibly July, where we're not doing one for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Just couldn't get it over the finish line. With our 50th anniversary having happened last April, we're still trying to come down off of that. That was a very multifaceted piece of work that we put together. Very proud of it, but it took a lot of energy to do it. So in June, we'll be recognizing two folks or two entities that have been particularly important to the anti-rape movement. And we're trying to do an intergenerational kind of recognition. So we'll be recognizing the San Francisco Youth Commission and the transformative justice work that they've been doing. And we'll also, and very excited that we're also going to be recognizing Professor Harry Edwards, longtime civil rights icon that everyone knows him there in terms of the work that he did around supporting the 1978 Olympic protest. Tommy Smith and John Carlos in protest at the 78 Olympics, standing with their fist raised high. That was all organized as part of the Olympic Project for Human Rights. And Professor Edwards is one of the longtime leaders of that, well-known sports sociologist. I know him from his work as an academic. But what very few people know about him is he has been long engaged in doing work around gender-based violence, and especially working with athletes, male identified athletes, around addressing their sexism, their misogyny, and holding them accountable for that. And so we're excited to be able to recognize Professor Edwards in that work that he's done. He's also being inducted into the Bay Area Sports Hall of Fame in May. So on the heels of that, we'll get to recognize him too, for the under-recognized work that he's engaged in throughout his entire civil rights history. Um, so I'm going to stop there. I talked about our services. I talked about our philosophy. I told you a little bit about the event that we're going to be doing in June, July. It'll be at the Women's Building. As soon as I get publicity, I'll get it out to Black Women Revolt for folks to share within your networks. I do want to show you this short video next. But before I do, I want to raise up two historical figures that are so important to Black women's role in the anti-rape movement. And my guess is that probably some of you are familiar with these folks. Um, I'm going to put both of their names in the chat. My T is not working on my computer. Ida B. Wells Barnett and Rosa Parks. Now, I think all of us, if you do know these names, again, it might feel like a Harry Edwards moment in that you think of them as civil rights icons, which they are. Ida B. Wells Barnett and Rosa Parks are absolutely that. But both of them have a history of having done work to address sexual assault that often is not recognized. So we think about Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching work in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And she was very clear in her writing and in her acknowledgement that Black women were often sexually assaulted and lynched. She wanted the sexual assault of Black women to be raised up. She really challenged the myth of the Black male rapist, the idea that Black men are the only rapists and they only rape white women. She really held up the idea that no, often Black women are raped by white men, and that sexual violence needs to be recognized. Um, and to think about doing that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, during a time of Jim Crow segregation and the backlash after emancipation, it was high risk activism that Ida B. Wells Barnett was involved in, and she definitely was one of our early anti-rape activists that we need to recognize. Um, and then I want to say a little bit about Rosa Parks, because I think, again, the work that we know about Rosa Parks, which is so important, is her work with the Montgomery bus boycott in the 50s. But a full 11 years before she even worked on the Montgomery bus boycott as part of the NAACP, she was engaged with doing anti-rape work in Abbeville, Alabama. She was sent in by the NAACP to Abbeville because Reese Taylor had been sexually assaulted, 24-year-old mother, had been sexually assaulted by 6 white men when she was walking home. And Reese Taylor recognized all of these men, knew them from her community, small community. And she took the brave step in 1944 of saying she wanted to report the rape, her abduction and rape to the police. So she and her father made that report. Again, think about the profound courage in 1944 Alabama to take that step. And the NAACP saw that, and they sent Rosa Parks to help support a campaign for justice for Reese Taylor. So Rosa Parks went to Abbeville and worked with Reese Taylor and the community there to raise up the issue. It's phenomenal to say this. They're actually the case moved forward. There was a grand jury that actually heard the evidence against the 6 white men. To think about that, it even went to that. There was even a grand jury convened is amazing. That shows the kind of mobilization and power that was invested into this. Sadly, the grand jury, which happened to be all white men, lo and behold, they opted not to indict any of the men, even though many of them acknowledged that they had raped Reese Taylor. Right? It wasn't like they were saying this didn't happen. But again, the Jim Crow racism was just so intense. But to even get to that piece, that step is profoundly important. So knowing that Rosa Parks was doing anti-rape work in the 40s, even before the Montgomery bus boycott in 55, is really important for us as a movement to hold up, is for Black women to hold up, right? Those of us who are doing work on gender-based violence. So telling that story, that piece of her is profoundly important. So I'm going to shift a minute, and I know it's 12:48, so I'm going to rush into showing you, sharing this video with you. Let me see if I can get it. Let's see if I can make it happen. Okay. Can you all see my screen? Okay. Let me tell you a little bit about this video. There are some additional important OG Black feminists who are featured in this 13-minute video. Loretta Ross, who was one of the first Black women in the United States to direct a rape crisis center, who also went on to be the co-founder of Sister Song, Women of Color Reproductive Justice, collaboration collective that's out of Atlanta. Loretta is very well known in reproductive justice and gender-based violence communities and in communities that are doing work around human rights. So she's featured in this short clip. So is Barbara Smith, who's most known for her work with the Combahee River Collective. The Combahee River was the river that Harriet Tubman crossed many times in order to emancipate and free slaves from the South. So they named themselves after that river. And kind of thinking about forging through the river, right? That resilience. So Combahee, Barbara was part of that Black lesbian feminist group for a long time. She also was one of the founders of Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, with a lot of other amazing folks like Sherry Moraga, who still is in San Francisco. Barbara and Loretta are really important figures in the anti-rape movement too, Black women figures. And so is Jamie Lee Evans, who's featured as part of this video. Jamie is my sister friend of Asian descent, of Chinese descent, who was probably the second Asian staff member at SFWAR. So I'm going to play this short clip. I'll stop it right at. I thought I had more time. I'll stop it right at 1 o'clock. You may not see it all, but we'll get it started. So here we go.
We were a energetic center. We had a lot of things going on. We organized the first national conference on women of color and violence against women. I think we called it Third World Women back then. In 1980 at Howard University, we brought together hundreds of women of color who are just now getting their feet in the movement. And I remember, Barbara, just to bring it back to you, people from Boston came talking about the murdered and missing Black women of Boston, coming from that community. That was where I met Beth Ritchie, and just a whole lot of connections were made at that 1980 conference. So I feel fortunate to have been in on the ground floor as a rape and incest survivor myself, who was able to find her voice and find her words and find her life's path in doing that anti-violence work.
One of the things I would say that I think it's really important for people to know, given that this is the 50th anniversary of one of the major violence against women organizations in the United States, is that there was a time when there were none, as in zero. And that was a very different landscape than what we see now. One of the questions I think that people who are involved in this work constantly ask ourselves is, why has it not ended? Why is there still, I don't know proportionally if it's as much violence against women, I don't know if there's less, but it still continues. And the services, the shelters, the advocacy, all of the things that violence against women organizations do, they're still all needed. And the reason, of course, is that patriarchy has not been toppled, because this is systemic oppression. I'll just say that Loretta was talking about 1979. That was a key year for those of us in the Combahee River Collective, because although we were not a violence against women organization, we were a Black feminist organization that was very involved with the Boston women's movement. And that was a very vibrant women's movement in Boston. We had lots of institutions. We had a feminist women's health center. We had 2 women's schools. We had more than 1 feminist newspaper. We had a restaurant. We had a credit union, and we had a world-class bookstore. I mean, just imagine. And a lot of those things that I mentioned were all in easy walking distance of each other. In Cambridge, not in Boston, where a lot of the people of color live, but still, you know, it made a difference to have that. The early 1979, January of 1979, 2 young Black women's bodies were found in trash containers in Roxbury. And as I said, they were teenagers. I think that amongst the women who continued to be murdered during that period, I think they had been sexually assaulted. And the report about these murders in the Boston Globe, one of the leading newspapers in the nation to this day, and the big city newspaper in Boston, the reports of those murders of those two young women appeared in the back of a newspaper on the same page as the racing forms, that is horse racing, the racing forms. In other words, not news at all, not considered to be important. The murders continued to happen. They happened very swiftly. By the time around 4 months had elapsed, 12 women had been murdered. And the number, just like you're talking about, was the DC Rape Crisis Center the first one? I think that sometimes we get wrapped up in statistics and chronology and what have you. We generally say that 12 women were murdered, Black women were murdered during that period. One of the women was a white woman murdered in a Black neighborhood. And I do believe that after we stopped counting, that maybe at least one other Black woman was murdered, say in June of that year. It was a demoralizing time. And we really did some transformative organizing, particularly around coalitions in Boston, because eventually we were bringing together communities of color, not just the Black community, because other women of color and people of color were concerned about this too. They lived in the same neighborhoods. And so we were bringing together people of color and also feminists and, amazing to say, lesbians, all of whom who were concerned about these issues. And I could go on about that, but I consider it to be the peak organizing that ComBT ever did, because it brought together everything we had been doing up until then. We started in 1974, and in 1979, we had the wherewithal to make a difference in a metropolitan area, a big US city, around an issue that people were trying to just ignore.
So 50 years ago, I was about 7. I just turned 57, and if I could just place my part of the work in a personal place, my mom brought home, well, some dude brought home my mom and sexually assaulted her in our living room. And I was 7, and I was like, what the? And so I ran out into the living room, and this little 7-year-old girl, and I said, get the fuck out of the house. And he just looked at me, and he was sizing me up, and he was thinking about what he might do to me. And I just stood my ground, roots into the earth, and I said, get the fuck out of my house. And he did. And SFWAR was just beginning, and so needed by women and girls like my mom and myself, and still so very needed.
And I want to say, Jamie, I love the idea of you. Not only love it, it just fills my heart that you, as a 7-year-old, would stand your ground against an adult male who was abusing your mother, and you got that individual out of your house. I mean, that is a beautiful thing. And yeah, but as I said, when you live in a society that's not well, and our society is not well, it's not healthy, particularly healthy. Some parts of it are. You will see those kinds of things happening. And the most important thing is for us to be able to talk about these things and to work together.
I want to pause here because I know I have 2 minutes left. Do folks want to see the rest of this? It's about 6 minutes. If not, we can stop it. I can direct you to the SF4 website where you can see the full interview. This is a 13-minute cut of the interview with Loretta Ross, Jamie Lee Evans, and Barbara Smith. So it's up to you all. I want to make sure that people have some time if you've got questions. So should we stop here? I'll take guidance from whoever wants to give it to me around. Should we stop and open it for some conversation, or would folks prefer to see the rest of this if you have time?
Hey, Janelle, we are actually going to go on and do a hard stop because
Okay.
my lovely staff and all of our crazy today have the Huckleberry Youth street fair that they have to get to
Okay.
kind of support there. So they're about to truck across town to go and prepare for that. I did
Okay.
want to say thank you for being here, and we had questions, but we've emailed you those questions, and I think if we can get you to answer those, what we're going to do is blast out this video along with those questions. And we're probably going to invite you back so we can have a better Zoom experience because what you have to say is timely, relevant, and very important. We definitely want to thank you for being here for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We want to thank WAR for standing in the gaps for those of us who are survivors of sexual assault. And I will say, WAR has definitely been life altering for me personally, and I love and appreciate you all. Um, and I think at this time, we're just going to go on and let you say some final closing words, and we will regroup and get you back here on a proper time. And if all else fails, we'll have you out for our DVAM event in October.
Awesome. Thank you, Pamela. I appreciate that. You know, I'm my guess is most of the folks here are engaged in this work. I think what I will say right now, I know it feels like drinking from a fire hose nonstop in terms of the attacks on communities that many of us are part of, communities that we have friends and family members that are a part of. So I think now more than ever, I'm going to resonate what Barbara Smith said, working together, finding the ways we're connected, forming alliances. I think that's the way we're going to withstand this current storm. Yeah, I really, again, very, very honored to get the opportunity to share some space with you all. And I'm sorry that we didn't have more time for questions. My apologies. I love talking about history. I can't stop
I was
myself.
about to say everything that you gave was everything that we needed. We just needed more times because we want more.
Okay, well,
So we are looking
know where to
forward to,
find me.
yes, we are looking forward to having you back and answering those questions and might maybe even doing a little deeper dig because even hearing the history of the organization has been enlightening. And so we certainly appreciate your time and we love and appreciate that you're still educating the masses and helping to bring up those new leaders in this area because it's needed. And in these new changing times, again, it is going to continue to be needed and we have to band together. So thank you for being part of the leadership that is helping us to move forward.
Absolutely. And thank you all. It's really refreshing to be, you know, you all remind me of New Orleans. When I worked in New Orleans, most of my colleagues were women of African descent, and I miss that time. I really miss that time. I love SFWAR, but sometimes I don't see as many Black women as I'd like to. So I really am very, again, it feels really humbling to get to spend time with you and to have this space. So,
You just sparked an
yeah.
idea because we see women here, so we definitely can collaborate and make sure that they're getting over into that vital space.
Good deal. Well, thank you all. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you.
All right. Well, thank you
Thank
everybody
you.
for being here, and we're going to go on and hop off. This was Crucial Conversations for the month of April. Happy sexual, if you can say happy, Sexual Aware Assault Awareness Month. Happy that we have options and happy that we have help. Let's say that. And I will go on and say, everybody have a better than amazing day, and we will see you all next month. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.